with the Water Institute at UNC. And our first speaker today will be Drew Capone from Indiana University. That's my word, sorry. Oh, right. I'm going to say all.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Kevin. I'm Drew Capone, transitioning from a postdoc at UNC to a faculty position at Indiana University. Today, I'm going to be talking about the impact of a sanitation intervention on infection risks from fly-contaminated foods in Maputo, Mozambique. So let's get in and talk about some flies today. All right, so I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with the F diagram of fecal-oral disease transmission. This is the original F diagram from Wagner and Illinois back in 1958. And as you can see, even 50 years ago, we recognized the importance that enteric pathogens that are shed in human feces are transferred through the environment through environmentally mediated pathways. And one of those pathways includes flies, which are landing on human feces, and then possibly landing on food or other surfaces which may be ingested to cause new infections. We're really interested because this is one of the specific pathways on the F diagram. So I decided to dig into the literature, and I went way back into the literature because a lot of this work was done 50 to 100 years ago. So I found a lot of great books on flies and disease transmission from the early 1900s up until about 1973, which is when I considered the Bible of flies and disease by Greenberg, was written in 1973. If you want book recommendations, find me after this. And from the literature, I found that flies serve as potential vectors. Enteric pathogens may be found on their body or in their alimentary canal, and these pathogens may actually survive passage through the alimentary canal, including the potential regrowth for some bacteria. Then we can use things such as physical barriers to reduce fly counts. That includes things like ventilation pipes with mesh screens, or water seal toilets, which prevent flies from accessing or breeding in fecal sludge in these pit latrines. Now, as you know, flies are flying around in the environment and they are highly mobile, but their mobility is often dependent on available food sources. So we were really curious where we're working in Maputo, Mozambique, where population densities often exceed 15 to 20,000 people per square kilometer, that would an on-site sanitation intervention delivered at a compound scale, so not at a neighborhood scale, but I may have gotten it, but my neighbors may have not, could we have seen this move the needle in terms of enteric pathogens and flies and the risks that they pose? If you go and you do enough field work in Maputo and other low-income settings, you look down pit latrines, you're going to see flies, you're going to see fly larvae. We saw this all over the place. I got really interested in it during field work. This is me and Sergio in 2018. We're eating rice and beans, starting to think about what are the risks of flies laying on my food during my lunch during field work, and not only for me, but for members of these communities who are living there and eating and consuming food every day in and around flies. So this work was done as part of the Maputo sanitation trial. This is a controlled before and after trial of an on-site sanitation intervention. The intervention is up there on the right. It is a pour flush toilet to a septic tank with a soak-away pit. And I have the red arrows there to indicate some of the fly control measures that were a part of this intervention. That included the ventilation pipes with mesh netting and a water seal toilet. So these help prevent flies from getting access to the fecal sludge that was contained within these systems. Now, this was not a randomized controlled trial, it was a controlled before and after trial. So what we have, you see flies on yellow paper there, indicating that we left sticky traps overnight at latrine entrances and food preparation areas for our control and intervention compound, both before the delivery of this intervention and 12 months later. And I will acknowledge this, most of these flies were caught back in 2015 and 2016 by my colleagues Jackie Nee and Trent Sumner before I even started working on the MAPSIN trial. So a lot of this work is years and years of effort by a variety of individuals. Okay. So we collected those flies. I went to Mozambique, found them back on -80 freezer, shipped them back to our lab at Georgia Tech at the time, and I was doing some of this work at UNC during my postdoc. Went to the literature, talked to some of the colleagues, found protocols to extract total nucleic acids from flies using commercially available QIAGEN kits. And then to evaluate enteric pathogens that may be present in these flies and quantify the gene copies from them, we used custom TACMan array cards. These looked for 22 common enteric pathogens. So that's a range of bacterial, viral, protozoan, and hominid targets. So The meat and potatoes of this analysis, because we not only wanted to measure what are the concentration of these enteric pathogen targets in these flies, but we wanted to do quantitative microbial risk assessment to estimate the risks of infection from consuming food that may have been contaminated by these flies. The methods behind this was actually a separate paper we published in Risk Analysis this year. What our model does is it's producing ratio measures of effect with quantitative microbial risk assessment. So we took the gene copy measurements for individual flies that you can see them on the top right. We fixed those for our individual fly samples. We then proceeded with standard stochastic QMRA. So we made some very conservative assumptions based off values in the literature to estimate if a fly lands on your food once a week, what percentage of the enteric pathogens that we detected may be transported to that food. Then we recognized the gene copies that we were measuring via PCR may not necessarily come from viable organisms. And we used a ratio of cultural E. coli to gene copies of E. coli to estimate the viability associated with gene copies of specific pathogens that we were detecting. We fit those with pathogen-specific dose response models from the literature, and then generated single annual risks of infection per microbial measurement. This allows us to tie the variance in our estimated annual risks of infection back to our individual fixed microbial measurements. Fit this into a Monte Carlo simulation, repeated this 10,000 times so that we be able to include 95% confidence intervals, or be able to get the mean as there is some individual variability in our individual models. And then we did Poisson regression on our annual risks of infection. So the outcome of this model is what was the impact of this intervention on the estimated annual risk of infection attributable to flies landing on your food. So as I mentioned, this wasn't an RCT, so we had to do something called a difference in difference analysis. And I'll just quickly walk you through the regression equations just to understand a little bit of the math that's going on behind the scenes here. So my y-axis here is, say, estimated annual risk of infection from Giardia from 0 to 100%. And then my x-axis is time both before and after intervention. So in our regression equation, we're taking into account there's initial values in our control group, the red line, that there's differences initially between control and intervention, and that there's some change in time. So what we're measuring is beta 3 here. And the fundamental assumption that we're making is that if we had not implemented this intervention, we would have observed a parallel trend. We've observed the same trend in our intervention compared to our control group, but we're hoping that we actually see a reduction, and that's what we're measuring with beta 3. So here's the results that we found. So from those fly traps that we stuck and left overnight at latrine entrances and food preparation areas, my y-axis is the number of flies that we caught on these traps, and x-axis is both before and after these interventions. We found a 69% reduction in fly counts at latrine entrances, but we found no impact of the intervention on fly counts at food preparation areas. Then at a high level with the PCR data, we ran 178 flies from both of our arms before and after the intervention. And we found about half of these individual flies were positive for at least one enteric pathogen at baseline. We saw a small reduction in our control group, and then a slightly larger reduction in prevalence of at least a single pathogen in our intervention group. So about 27% of individual flies were positive for at least one enteric pathogen 1 year after the delivery of the sanitation intervention. Okay. Then what we're looking at here is my y-axis is my log 10 transformed gene copies per individual fly, and my x-axis is the targets we were looking for on TAC, as well as on the left there, the culturable and gene copies of E. coli that we're using to estimate viability. So what we'll see there is we have bacterial, helminth, protozoan, and viral targets. We found similar pathogens where each one of these dots represents an individual fly and the detection of a fly. So we found things like pathogenic E. coli, Shigella, Vibrio cholera in flies. We found actually about 10% of these flies were positive for Trichuris, which is a soil transmitted helminth. One fly was positive for Ascaris, quite a bit of Giardia, as well as a range of viral pathogens like adenovirus, norovirus, and astrovirus. So I don't have time to get into all of the data and all of the modeling here, but I wanted to give you a snapshot of what one of these iterations of the model looks like for a specific pathogen. Here what we have is Giardia. So these are kernel density plots that just are where the y-axis is the density. Think of it as like a smoothed out histogram. And my x-axis is the annual risk of infection. So what's critical to point out here is these dotted lines are the mean annual risks of infection. So what we're seeing for Giardia is that the blue for our intervention, the mean risk of infection was actually greater than our controls at baseline, but then that flips. So 12 months later, the mean annual risk of infection from Giardia was lower than at our control groups. So our models does this. And then, as I mentioned, we did a Monte Carlo simulation, didn't do this 10,000 times to smooth out some of this heterogeneity, as there is a lot of variability in our model, and fit those into cosine regression models to estimate the impacts on infection risks. This generates risk ratios. So it was only able to do this for the pathogens that we detected at least 5% of these samples to warrant doing so with regression modeling. And as we'll see, what points out right away, where my y-axis is the different pathogen targets we were looking for, and my x-axis is the adjusted risk ratios for the impact on estimated annual risk of infection. Point estimate for EPEC, enteropathogenic E. coli, suggests maybe actually increased risk. But for all the other targets, it was to the left of one, indicating that potentially there's a protective effect of this intervention. However, all these confidence intervals are wide and include one. We also did a pooled estimate for all these targets simultaneously. The point estimate suggests perhaps it decreased the risk of infection for a hypothetical pathogen by 15%. But again, the confidence interval is wide, so we don't have a lot of, we aren't able to say whether this effect was statistically significant or not. Okay. So some discussion and conclusions. Flies are incredibly interesting. And I think one of the things when I went to the literature, and I found actually a systematic review of some of this data, this might be the first PCR-based detection of human enteric viruses in wild-caught flies. I tried, I didn't see anywhere else. So I haven't seen anyone else detect norovirus, rotavirus, astrovirus in wild-caught flies before. So that might be something novel that we were able to do. Overall, all these results corroborate the other results from the MAPSAN trial. So this is Jackie Nee's work that was published in eLife as the main outcome. And the MAPSAN trial, the sanitation intervention, to not dramatically reduce enteric infection and diarrhea among children. So we corroborate that we did not see dramatic reductions in the estimated annual risk of infection from flies landing on food in Maputo. Highly corroborative. It's also similar to what we were seeing in soils where there's no dramatic reductions in environmental fecal contamination. So, but what I think this does suggest is that we have these different environmental transmission pathways that enteric pathogens are moving through the environment. And there hasn't been a lot of work done on flies specifically in the last few decades. It does suggest that we're finding a wide range of enteric pathogens, high concentrations of enteric pathogens. And we know these flies are landing on food and surfaces in the living environment. So perhaps the fly food ingestion transmission pathway may be underappreciated in this and similar environments. I'll also throw in there's other things to think about, like cockroaches, rats, and mice that may be doing acting like similar vectors. Some fun fly facts. Just to demonstrate how prolific flies are at moving enteric pathogens throughout the environment. Some work from the early 1900s, 1910 and 1917, they fed houseflies once on milk, and we're finding anywhere from 16 to 31 specks, so that's vomit or excreta from individual flies from a single feeding. So flies that are feeding on human feces or fecal sludge have an incredible capacity to be transmitting these pathogens through the environment. I was also impressed. There's some work where someone fed Entamoeba histolytica to flies, and the passage in the alimentary canal varied from as little as 5 to 10 minutes, and they're still going to find these cysts being shed a day later. So a wide range depending on different factors that really weren't well quantified. And just one of the interesting facts, possibly why we detected Trichuris and not Ascaris is the morphology. Trichuris is narrower and may actually fit down through the mouth parts of a housefly, where Ascaris is larger and may not fit. So in conclusion, effective fly control is absolutely necessary to reduce risks. We can do that through fly control measures such as source control by reducing flies' access to fecal sludge in latrines, and then contact control for things like traps and insecticides. So just acknowledge that all the contributions for everyone in the Brown Lab, Jackie Nee, who's at LSHM, are great collaborators in Mozambique. And this work is a contribution from my time at Georgia Tech, UNC, and now at IU. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Drew. If you have questions, I'll come to you.
Joe, I probably just missed this, but can you say how you accounted for transfer efficiencies? You mentioned the vomit at the end, so.
Yeah.
That's what you did, and then did you also consider like rows of pathogens on food over time, like when we worry about functions, food stays out, all day, doesn't get repeated, stuff like that.
So there's just not a lot of good data in these areas, right? So we had to make some simplifying assumptions to do this kind of modeling. So we had to make very conservative assumptions that flies are landing on children's food or on food once per week, and that food is immediately being consumed. We didn't take into account any lag, or that fly would land on food and then maybe it's sitting out overnight. We were just trying to make this model simpler and not take into account the real world heterogeneity that may exist. The transfer efficiency, again, there's not a lot of great data out there. I did find one paper that was trying to quantify the mass of fly specks. So I just took a really conservative assumption and I fit a distribution to the mass of the flies that we were measuring and the mass of these fly specks and divided the mass of the fly speck by the fly. So it's just this very low percentage of transfer efficiency. There's really not, I haven't seen this work out there. So we were just trying to take something very conservative in terms of what the transfer efficiency could be. Because typically when we've looked at fecal indicator bacteria, I've seen this in other studies, 80% of fecal indicator bacteria is in the alimentary canal, maybe 20% is on the bodies. And then how this is being transported to food is just not well characterized.
Okay, so sorry, you made an assumption or whatever, literature values are like.
Yeah.
Spec.
Yeah, the mass of a fly. So basically the mass of a fly vomit or a fly defecation event.
Great. I'm glad we have that.
Yeah. It's a fraction of a milligram. And then I divided that by a random pull of the mass of a fly, which is 10, 20 milligrams. So, yeah. David?
So I'm curious about your pathogen data and whether you have any sense of, do you have some super flies that are average pathogen per fly? Like, is this uniformly, I know you did have to do the 0-1 cutoff for stuff, I understand that, but I'm just curious, when you do see flies, what's the average number of pathogens? Are any pathogens grouping together that could give you some idea of what the source is for those flies? And are there any like super spreader flies?
Yeah, if you stopped on my poster on Monday, we also have antimicrobial resistance ARG data for all of these flies. And talking to some folks in the AMR community, it's an area I want to tease this out on an analysis a little bit more. We weren't seeing, I would say, like super flies. We were having, well, the mean number of enteric pathogens was close. The mean number was close to about 0.5, 0.7. So most flies were only finding one enteric pathogen. We weren't finding multiples. That was pretty normal. Yeah.
Interesting work, Drew. Is this thing on? Can you hear me? I'm kind of interested in, I know you've done all this historical reading into the history of flies and WASH and public health, and it seems like fly research kind of petered out over the years.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories as to why that would be? Why, I mean, the WASH community, we haven't talked about flies very much. We don't talk about flies. Where did the interest go?
I think as ventilated and improved pilotrines developed, and the thought around fly control was, oh, we need to have ventilated pilotrine, we need to have mesh netting. That was, I haven't found anywhere talking about this in the literature. This is just kind of my feeling is, as these developed, we thought that's fly control, and it hasn't really been explored since then in terms of what other interventions might be possible, what other technologies are useful. That is, as long as we're putting a physical barrier between flies and the fecal sludge, then that's our fly control measures. And that's what I could kind of gather, is that people kind of thought we have these interventions, and it hasn't really been explored since then in terms of what else can be done. Yeah, besides some other like insecticide treatment or using traps.
Yeah. One more question. I apologize if the answer to this, but in settings where you've got open grains that are or may be receiving excreta, is fly control and VIP latrines just kind of ineffective, just given the all the other places that flies can come into contact with excreta?
Yeah, I think it's really, fly control is really challenging in these really high population density urban areas for a variety of reasons, right? That they can, anywhere that they're finding fecal waste or similar waste that they can breed. So that might be in the solids around open drains. I mean, in my work this year, there's fly control around open drains and especially like public dumpsters. It's just it's really hard to control breeding when there's lots of waste being generated and not safely managed. Flies can breed in fecal sludge. They can breed in the crusts of septic tanks. So if septic tanks crack or they're open, the flies can get into them. The flies are still able to breed inside septic tanks. So it's incredibly challenging. As long as they have opportunities to find places they can breed, they will do so. Yeah.
Thank you, Drew. All right, next up, please welcome Bismarck. Kentia Apiana, University.
Yes. Okay, good afternoon. Is Ben around? Yes, Ben is here. So. Okay. The topic is collective action in WASH for improving animal fecal management. And as I mentioned, Ben is one of the guys or the team members. So, in fact, animal feces, as we might all be aware, pose risks to health. And this is especially true for kids or younger children. But we also know that traditional WASH interventions, even including behavior change interventions, pay little attention to animal fecal management. So World Vision decided to use a natural care group approach to kind of improve the health of rural communities in Ghana. And then the idea or the strategy is to use a collective action where there should be collaboration, accountability, and then individuals should also take actions, which could even be expensive by investing in basic infrastructure. So this is map of Ghana, and we have Sablugu. I think it used to be Sablugu Nampo, now it's now Sablugu Municipal. And then we also have Setra East, which were the study areas. So we had volunteers who were recruited, which were called the Natural Care Group. They were trained by promoters, which were working with World Vision of offices. So if there's a possibility with this approach, you could also recruit government staff like environmental health officers or community development officials. And then once the care group members are trained, it is expected that they can cascade whatever they have learned among the neighboring community members, especially the women groups. So what approach did we adopt? In fact, the intervention, we were not part, but I mean, the research phase, that's where I come in, but the methodology is what we are talking about here is for the review that we or the assessment, the evaluation that we went in to do is purely qualitative. Ben did the quantitative aspect, but what I'm presenting here today is a qualitative aspect. So we use a focus group discussion and then that of in-depth interview with participants from the community. So we work with 6 communities from the north and then 6 from the south. And the communities, we chose 3 in each of these places, successful communities, 3 successful communities, and 3 communities that were tagged less successful. So that's what we did. And we followed with the analysis, we followed the usual, qualitative analysis approach. So the key questions that really guided this evaluation is what has worked or what did work well, and then to what extent has the approach influenced animal fecal management within these communities, and are there opportunities for integration into especially the governance structure for sustainability. So Now, if you look at the results, in fact, the reason why this table is presented, we found out that in the south, where the central east, men, some few men volunteered to join the national care group, which was quite interesting, unlike the north, which was purely women driven. And we asked them, and they said, well, they felt they could be supporting their wives. So that was interesting. So in all, 151 female participants and then just 4 males. But we didn't see any much change with the involvement of the women. We asked the benefits, I mean, the kind of animals that are being reared by these or being raised by this community, rural folks. And it's basically almost the same across, but the benefits are basically, cash. Sometimes they sell them to feed themselves, also to pay children fees, and even to support livelihood. These are coming from the women, and also for celebration, maybe special occasions, Christmas, and then religious activities. And then we also found out that some were using it for the pets, like dogs and cats, for security purposes as well as hunting. That's basically the main message. And then what have they been doing, maybe prior to the intervention, and then what were some of the major challenges. And then we saw that there were less incentives. I mean, they were not motivated to do anything with respect to the managing the animals and even managing the feces. No motivation, no incentive for what? And what were some of the challenges? I think the low incentive is one of them, the major one. But some were doing something. I mean, temporary structures, especially in the north, when it is rain season, they can get some sticks, shrubs, break them and provide some basic shelter, which were just for a season. And most of the time they gave up. Some too were just occasionally sweeping their pens or the animal shelter. And then others too knew that only, birds, droppings from birds could be used for manure. So, and effectiveness of the intervention, how do we see it? Really, we saw that the World Vision intervention raised awareness and levels, and people or the rural folks were actually, especially in the north, which was physically evident, they were practicing co-composting animal feces with organic waste, and it was obvious in their speech. You could see them in the community. Pictures will be shown shortly. And for the South, they only said whether it was true or not, we couldn't verify. And then with respect to animals, whether they are keeping them in shelter, penning them, it was mixed. Some were doing it, others were not. But it was largely, maybe if there's any penning at all, it is in the evenings or after the animals had returned from grazing. But subsequently, we asked, I think we will show it, we asked community members if they were happy, and the evidence was clear. And I remember when we went, we even knocked down our food car knocked down one of the animals in the community. Unfortunately, it was killed. So we had to pay compensation. So so this is what was they were practicing especially in the north as physical evidence, and they attributed it to the intervention. And unfortunately, but there were still some animals, especially the bears, which they said is difficult to control. They were still out there. I mean, they are doing something, even though it's not the best, but they believe it's better than they used to do. This one is within the neighborhood. They are now heaping the animal feces, and then they add, biomass from maybe I think granule shells, peanut shells, and they were composting. And then the other one is within a neighborhood, and it's a bigger one. They were converting their old dump site to like co-composting, where they are now adding animal droppings so that they could, turn it to compost for farm in the farming season. So we asked the groups, are they satisfied with what they are doing? And if you look at the results, for the focus groups, it's largely the evidence is clear. They are not certified. Why? Because there's awareness that they can do more. There is awareness that through the program, animal feces is not safe as probably they see human feces. Now they are aware that their kids, when they are growing, maybe at that early stage, they could easily pick, animal droppings and be eating them. Now, individually, some of them are taking actions, but they are not seeing the scale, a scale. So they are not happy, they are not satisfied. But with the in-depth interview individual, you find out that in the north, a couple of I think most of the women that we talked to, 8 out of 10 were satisfied. But in the south, it was otherwise. So the awareness is there, but then they need support. So what is the key message? As I indicated, awareness has been raised. Now there is a consciousness to do something about managing the animals, especially managing the feces. And then even now they know they can add value to the animal feces by turning to compost. And also there is a challenge with respect to penning the animals, keeping them in shelter. Then you have to feed them the whole day. Where do you get the feed? In the wet season, we realize that they will be okay. They are comfortable. In the dry season, watering becomes a challenge, especially in the north, and feeding becomes a problem. So that sort of becomes a burden. And then the practices is mixed, but it's now more or less individuals, especially those who are more or less frontliners. They are doing something. They are doing action. They are raising pens or structures, but then there's not much satisfaction as to the collective action or community-wide action. And it's also, it was seen that individually, there has been a cascading effect or influence. But then at a certain level, you need, a certain kind of authority. Opinion leaders, the assembly, local government, assemblymen have to come in. But that is not forthcoming. I think in the South, when they started, the opinion leaders were key, unit committee members were key, but after some time, they sat back. So the collective action for transformation at the community level, where everybody is on board, is a bit challenging for them. So what are the recommendations? In fact, in the north, we realized that the women were okay. They have gotten the concept, they are happy. But then the decision mostly rested with the husbands or the male-headed person, the male head of the family. So where in the south, we realized that some men were sort of involved in the north, it appeared it was the inception phase that men were on board. But when it came to taking action at the community level, the household level, the women were complaining that their men were not understanding the action or what needed to be done. And then it also, this intervention is good, it's useful, but it requires technical support. You cannot just leave because they say, well, what do we do in terms of infrastructure or the facility or the pen or the shelters for the animals? Is there any low-cost technology that we can easily, probably indigenous, that we can improve upon it? So they were expecting something of that sort. And also, how do they, feed the animal all year round if they are supposed to keep them and pen them? So, and then it was because the project was also linked with total integrated sanitation or behavior change approach. They were told of also they need to own household toilet, but then how do they get it? So they didn't know anything about sanitation marketing. So probably in subsequent interventions elsewhere, we need to have integrated behavior change intervention. So this is to acknowledge the support of World Vision office in US and that of Ghana, and then their partners and as well as the area project offices in Ghana, both sub-legal SHREs, and then some field officers, community leaders, and then participants. So that's it. Thank you.
I had a question. Can you say more about the intervention and specifically about the bylaws? I saw that in there and I was like,
Yeah. For intervention, I think for the interventions, maybe Ben can support with that. But the what I know is that no, they had nurturing care group, which is predominantly women who are nurturing babies, and also those who are expecting, babies, pregnant women and all that. And they use that group because, sanitation and hygiene, it's more or less in Africa and Ghana, is women business or rules, or it's a core chores for women. So they target them and they use that with the hope that they will also influence their neighboring or their colleague women in their communities. And then with the laws, the unit committee, the local governance structure is made in such a way that at the community level, we have unit committees, and these are, they can have their own rules or community level bylaws. And then we also have the assembly, the district assembly, which is a local authority. They have gazetted bylaws, which is legal, and that one you can be taken to court and be fined or in prison or both. So where in the South, the assembly got interested, and then the unit committee or the opinion leaders, assemblymen got on board. They were, using those laws and rules, and in addition to their local unit community level rules. So that is where that came in. But when the interest subsided with these sort of opinion leaders or local authority, then the influence went down, and it's resorted back to individual efforts and actions.
we did similar work in Bangladesh, more focused on like sheds and infrastructure, and it's at poster 20, if anyone wants to know more about beach management. But it's good to see this, we're going to do another.
Okay.
Great, thanks so much, Chris Prodigy from the Water Trust. Great to see more agency work, and very interesting. I was wondering if you could talk about if there came out to be any sort of differences when talking about composting or manure management from different types of animals, in particular animals that are simply tied up or trained in some sort of way versus free range animals like poultry.
Okay. Good. Proud to what we learned as researchers, proud to the intervention. Most knew that only birds like the fowl, chicken, ducks, droppings could be used for application on their farm, not even composting it. They just picked it, and they realized that there were issues because some plants, suffered, so there wasn't interest. But then, by virtue of the intervention, they realized they could just store the feces elsewhere for a couple of weeks, especially the wet season, where there will be a bit of watering and all that, and then they take it to their farm, and they realize that, yeah, that one is working. And they were also taught that it's not only the birds, the sheep, the cattle, and all kinds of animals feces could be used. With the stray animals, what they do is that they clean their compound, the neighborhoods, and especially in the north where it was physically evident. They sweep the neighborhood, the women do that, their neighborhood, and add it to the heap. So it's not only the pen, but also the neighborhood feces are swept and added to the compost heap. Yeah, so.
Yeah, thanks very much for the nice presentation. I'm interested in the delivery method of the intervention. Did you try to find out what were the elements of the care group model that facilitated the change that we have been observed in this time? So what were the key issues in the modeling care group that brought out the results?
Okay. Yeah. I think with that, think the frequency, the promoters, they were, I think, the number of times they were meeting the care groups who were also to go to their neighbors or peers to do. I think while the program was the project was on, it was frequent, and the women gave such feedback that once the project ended, we were not seeing, the promoters, so it was sort of, I think, for me, the number of times they were interacting with the care group increased, and that would help. And then also, I think other activities that were combined, not only the animal physical management, but also the menstrual hygiene aspect, because it was more or less the women group. I realized that it also kept their interest in coming for meetings, and others also joined. Because in the South, I realized that the alternative, instead of using the commercially available sanitary pads, they were also adding, locally made sanitary pads to keep their interest, and also others were also coming to learn other things apart from the animal physics management. Because some of them were just keeping just one or two chicken, and so they saw it's not as a big deal. But then the additional, models or additional components of the program really help. And then also the what do we call it, the child nutrition, it helped. And I saw that as part of the program, they were also introduced to potato, planting, to enrich baby nutrition special. So I think these ones. So because when they are asking, are you coming to, help us go over what we learned? Because so because there were new people who have joined because of what they had, but then the project has ended. So it means that there should be the local assembly, which is the district assembly, which have environmental officers, community development officers, should be brought on board and be handed over for sustainability, so that they can continue to do that. Yeah.
Have they prepared training manuals?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, they show it to us different, and I think with one of the young women were teasing them. The young women also were reaching some of the nurturing care leaders that, oh, this particular woman, she only comes around all the time carrying the book, but so they were excited about the document because it has been laminated and they keep it around. Any meeting when they brought, they thought we were going to facilitate maybe training sessions, so they brought their documents and they were still intact. So yeah.
All right, thank you, Chris Martin. All right, last up, we have Tanvir from Bangladesh University, Engineering and Technology.
Hello, everybody. So this is actually the second time I'm presenting this. There was also a side event, so I personally I was also confused whether saying my name again in the presentation list. So anyway, here it is. I'll be talking about the barriers to using personal protective equipments by Western sanitation workers in some Bangladeshi cities. So, and this is a work actually was undertaken, an intervention study that was undertaken by IT and BUET, and it was initiated during the pandemic. And what we were actually looking at were the sanitation and waste workers who were involved in garbage collection, road sweeping, drain cleaning, septic tank and pit emptying, and medical waste handling. And we looked at their vulnerabilities, we studied their activities, and we applied an intervention. And after the intervention, we actually tried to look at what sort of factors actually affected their occupational health and safety. Now, sanitation and waste workers have been talked about a lot, and basically because One of the vulnerabilities stem from they operate in the informal economy. And of course, different variations of PPEs that they have, but sometimes it happens is that they are provided only a single class of PPE, and that's one of the source of problems. But also the activities vary quite a lot. Here you see the workers in the sanitation value chain, even for a particular point in the value chain, you have a range of activities requiring a range of PPEs. PPE requirement is different. The activities also require different types of, I mean, they are associated with different types of risks. Not all risks are the same, but that has to be customized actually when designing PPEs, and that's also one of the outcomes of this study. The key challenge is what we all know, that their occupational and environmental health and safety, it's a risk. They're exposed to multiple hazards, and not only because the hazardous work environment, their knowledge regarding the hazard is less. The people who actually they work under, the municipalities, those who are their supervisors, they also do not know about those risks, and they cannot guide them as well. So there is a huge capacity gap all over the persons who are involved and the persons who are running them. There is weak legal protection because most of them work informally, and most of them do not belong to any working groups or associations. That's why there's a weak agency to demand their rights. They have financial insecurity because they work informally, and their income is very unpredictable, variable, and there is less opportunities for health benefits and insurance, which is a concern. And not to mention the social stigma and discrimination. Basically, this is sometimes intergenerational, and these all are challenges that they have to face. If we even look at the places where they work and places where they live, there is actually not much of a difference. If you think that their working condition is working environment is hazardous, their living environment is nothing different. They live in low-income communities, slums, and where they have limited access to basic services, wash facilities, etc. And so I think that this pandemic has brought the issue of sanitation and waste workers to the front. And one of the reasons is that they played a frontline role in the pandemic. And of course, what I just want to say is that during the pandemic, they are facing a greater risk of infection. And because one of the things is that although we have the luxury of working from home, they do not. And they cannot stop their work, but the pay hasn't increased at all. They had limited PPEs, and so that means that if they're working in a hazardous environment, even with medical waste or all sorts of waste, which are probably infected with infectious pathogens, they have a heightened risk of infection. And also, it is thought that since they move around quite a lot from community to collect waste, they can be considered as an agent of infectious disease transmission. So that risk is also there. So if we do not take care of that risk can be transmitted to the general population as well. So during the pandemic, I think their heightened risk is also a concern for each and everyone. So what we are actually, the study that we focused on, it's basically a subset of a big study which we undertook in several municipalities and cities in Bangladesh. We looked at the workers groups, these 5 classes of workers groups, and we also interviewed the local government officials, and that included the conservancy waste management officers, mechanical engineers, inspectors, the DPH engineers, NGO representatives who are involved directly or indirectly with their work. And the total study can be divided into a quantitative and a qualitative study. The quantitative study was based on survey and structured observation. And the qualitative part was based on key informant interviews and in-depth interviews of the LGA officials and frontline workers. We recently published the quantitative part of the study, where we actually looked at how these different factors, their knowledge, attitude, and practice, their working environment, their socioeconomic condition, their vulnerabilities, how these affect their safety and occupational health at the workplaces. So, but what I'm going to talk about today is the qualitative study, which is based on KIs and IDIs. So we took informed consent, and it's based on interviews, so they're recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. So one thing that came up is that the PPEs that we are talking about, they're also not only protect the workers, but they're also important in giving them some sort of job satisfaction, social acceptance, and dignity. And it has been mentioned by several of the workers that having a PPE has given them some sort of, because they are all vulnerable, they are stigmatized, but when people see them wearing all these clothes and these colorful jackets, probably with the monogram of the municipality, then they get some attention, get a little bit of respect, and this is kind of highlighted by some of them. And so it happened that during the pandemic, they were very much ostracized. People don't want to come near them. They actually ridiculed them and so avoided them at all costs. But with these PPEs with colorful jackets and etc., they reported that the people are, talking them with some amount of respect. And they mentioned that people pay good attention to me. I feel better, and I mean, he's feeling safe, but he's also feeling respected. People didn't used to talk to me, but now they are giving me some attention and probably recognizing their work. So, and this when we undertook that capacity building or training activities, they also felt that their work is more valued, and that this was also highlighted by the conservancy officers through the interviews. And after that training session, they felt that there was a significant change in the working pattern among the workers. So this activity itself, I mean, arranging a training program on showing them how to use the PPEs, this activity itself was absent in the municipalities. And when this happened, the workers felt that their work is getting recognized, and it affected their work dynamics. But now we come to some of the concerns with the PPEs that they have traditionally been provided, and there were some issues that they also mentioned. Ideally, the PPE should be comfortable to wear, reflect heat, because they work in severe conditions, and prevent excessive sweating, and this is the requirement. But sometimes it was not the case. They found that after wearing the PPE, they felt shortness of breath, and then they basically didn't use it anymore. And they felt that the quality could be further improved if they used colorful uniforms and things like that. They found there were some issues with the gumboots, because that should be light, strong, durable, and the size should be proper. But sometimes they found that the boots were heavy. They lose interest in wearing them, and sometimes the material is such that after wearing a few times, they can get damaged and thrown out like that. The same issues with the hand gloves. They should be thick, durable, sweat reducing, but previously what they had was not according to the quality that they expected. And one important thing is that these PPEs has to be washed quite frequently. So after a few washing, if it gets damaged, then it's no use to them. So they mentioned that it would be good if it is not damaged after washing, and should be comfortable and well fitted. Another important issue that was highlighted is that the gender issues were not incorporated in the PPE design. In Bangladesh, the women who were engaged in the cleaning of the streets, they wear saris, and the PPEs, they don't, the gumboots actually are not suitable for them. And actually the male body structure and the female body structure is different. So when the PPEs were sized basically considering the male body structure. So when the woman found them, they found the gloves to be loose, the gumboots to be loose as well. And it was very uncomfortable. So and so most of the time they tried to ignore the gumboots and stuff. There were other issues as well. One thing they mentioned that the PPE should always have a spare PPE because most of them work at night, it gets wet. So in the next day when they have to come to work, it's not dry, so they cannot wear it. So they always need a spare PPEs. And this has also come out from the conservancy officer, is that regular training should be provided, and its training should not be a one-off thing. And they should have refresher training, and there should also be monitoring from the local waste management officers. So similar voices were heard in other studies. For example, in India, it's a water rate study. They found that they provided a PPE which is mainly made of plastic, and they felt very hot when they wore it. In Nepal, that was also plastic based, and they tore apart, and a woman didn't feel very good wearing those. So those issues were there. So in our quantitative study, this has also come up, and they mentioned that they felt suffocation, the PPE doesn't fit, and also we have seen that the PPEs were previously provided to them without any proper training. So when they received the PPEs, they basically shelved it over there, didn't use it, because they don't know how to use it. So PPE, this basically comes to the point that any PPE intervention should be associated with some form of training. So in conclusion, regarding the PPEs, if we want to summarize that from our findings, PPE is not only a protection for them, it's also a social acceptance, dignity, and it enhances the workers' engagement with and increases their job satisfaction. The PPE should be designed based on the user's perspective. The availability and comfortability should be ensured and should be associated with the refresher training, monitoring their use. Now, one thing I want to mention in the end of this one, in Bangladesh, we have a poor sanitation system, and we heard all about this wastewater-based epidemiology where you use the sewage samples to predict SARS-CoV-2 and making predictions of. But in Bangladesh, when we monitored, we do not have a sewage system, so to speak. So we found those SARS-CoV-2 in the samples in the drains, whether in the stormwater, so it conveys presumably sewage. And now you can imagine that if a drain cleaner is working and he is actually encountering sewage coming from the stormwater, and that basically we think that it's an increased risk. There are other factors during the pandemic, is that if you have an unsegregated waste collection, your medical waste can easily get mixed up with the domestic waste. Then the domestic waste becomes infectious waste. So, and if the workers are engaged, not knowing what they're in, and they were still working informally, the informal recyclers working without any sort of protection, that means they're also exposed to this infectious waste. And so domestic waste being mixed up with the medical waste, that's a big concern for the waste collectors. And if they do not work without proper hygiene, hand washing practice, and without PPE, then they are directly exposed. So some additional recommendations which are also talked about in addition to PPE provision and proper PPE design is that we talk about using technology, improvising our tools for manual cleaning. It has to come with financial support and incentives, training and awareness. And one thing is important, that we have to vaccinate all our waste sanitation workers, not only for COVID-19, but also other infectious diseases as well. And there has to be rigorous monitoring by the local government authorities. So finally, I want to say that at least 4 SDGs are directly or indirectly related with the sanitation and working conditions. And if we do not address this, then some of the SDG indicators will be lagging behind. And in the citywide inclusive sanitation framework, equity, safety, and sustainability has to be ensured, right? So, and safe in the safety category, it's not only safely managed sanitation. Safely managed sanitation means providing safety to everybody involved in the sanitation service chain as well. So if we do not take care of the waste and sanitation workers, our Swiss framework will not mean anything. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who were involved in the study. Our colleagues, basically the ICDRB colleagues were Mahmoud Alam and his team who actually did all the hard work. I'm just presenting here. My colleagues at ITN Buet and the DPHEC FSM Support Cell, the Gates Foundation, of course. Here I'm just showing a few manuals that we've developed at ITN Buet, developed in local language, which we use these manuals to train the waste sanitation workers. These are all customized, pictorial, less amount of text. And the other document is a national document, which is a COVID-19 vaccination priority list in Bangladesh. So ITN Buet, along with the FSM network, we advocated that when the vaccination program began, the waste sanitation workers should be prioritized in the vaccination, and the government basically heard us and they put their names in the priority list when the vaccination program started. So thank you very much for listening to me. You can find all sorts of information in the ITN website along with the other details of the report. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for the good presentation and really an area that needs further exploration. But maybe one question that I have for you is having looked at all this, looks like there's a problem. And is there any quick solution to this, especially with the key stakeholders, like the city council, the government, and how they can move forward to formalize this group of workers in this area?
One thing is that, of course, there is no quick fix because this their work has not started today, but it is an intergenerational thing. They're operating in an environment which is adverse not only for them, even their children. They also have to get into the same job sometimes. So it's an intergenerational thing. Breaking this is very, very hard. But I think at some point we have to think about formalizing them, at least putting them under some sort of association so that they have collective bargaining power and can demand some of these. But the municipality has its responsibility as well, because who is responsible for sanitation, safely managed sanitation in the country? It's delegated from the ministry to the municipality. So it's a municipality's responsibility to provide safely managed sanitation. Safely managed sanitation, I don't think that safely managed sanitation is that providing backup tags and FSTPs and ensuring the end use. You have to ensure the safety of all the people inside. So it is the responsibility of the municipality at some point. So that's my view.
Great, no, thank you so much. And that your answer right then kind of began to speak to my question, which is, you highlighted a lot of occupational safety and health issues, which are typically negotiated by unions or by collective bargaining. That can be challenging in certain areas, perhaps in Bangladesh. There's we see in India, sanitation workers agitating for change. Can you maybe talk about what are some of the differences in sort of trying to affect policy change in that type of area, which might be more politically sensitive than the more sort of like technocratic policy advising around, ideal PP, if that makes sense.
Actually, PP is not only a subset of the requirement that's part of my presentation here focused on PP, but there are other aspects as well. There's capacity building, there's this stigma that there's a cultural thing as well. These have to be overcome, and it's not very easy. But with the situation at hand that we have right now, the landscape that we have right now, there are certain activities that we can do, definitely, to protect them, bring them under the protection. And one of the important elements is the provision of the PPE, formalizing their activities, providing health insurance, safety. Safety is paramount, but what the final solution would be, I mean, if the country becomes developed, nobody has to take up their trash, if everything is mechanized. Well, that's a thought, but that's not happening very soon. So until that is happening, we have to provide some sort of protection to them with whatever means we have. And I think the local government officials in Bangladesh, they are aware of this issue. They recognize their importance. It's all about putting the resources there for the training and the capacity building. If the resources are allocated accordingly, it will go through. And we have seen that, because this was an intervention study, because we provided the PPEs in selected cities, and we did the training and capacity building, which were conducted by the LGA officials, and there was tremendous response. I mean, the energy level and everything that we observed was very positive. So a little bit of investment here, at least in Bangladesh, that I can say, it's going to make wonders. And I think that if the government sees this enthusiasm, maybe they will allocate the resources and we'll get the result out. Thank you.
Just a quick question, were these only municipal workers, or did you also look at private sector? Did they have their own workers, and was there any difference in sort of the PPE equipment?
So we targeted the municipal workers primarily. The private sector, well, in Bangladesh, there are not many places where the private sector is operating. Some dislodging trucks, which are operated by, privately, but that is not many. Usually the private sector takes care of their own capacity building. Like, the USAP sweep brand is there. That brand is associated on the premises that some sort of capacity building is already built inside their program. And the city officials contract them, and it's in the contractual documents required that they have to provide this, and this as a requirement for their services to continue. So in this intervention was for the totally unserved population who are not under any kind of safety net umbrella.
All right, thank you very much, Tanvir.